Our next speaker, Dr. Andrew Paul, who just asked a question to delay his presentation, but you can't delay any longer. Dr. Paul is an adjunct professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Calgary, Canada. He's also a SAB member, one of our longer standing ones, and I actually forgot to mention that Dr. Fausch is also one of our new SAB members. Oh, and for those of you who don't know what the acronym, that's the Science Advisory Board. So they're an independent panel of scientists that kind of keep an eye on the program, review our work, and provide independent scientific advice to the Trinity Management Council. Dr. Andrew Paul has been working as an aquatic ecologist in Western Canada for 35 years. His work has encompassed the fields of conservation biology, community restoration, non-native species invasions, population ecology, and river ecology. Andrew uses quantitative methods to aid in understanding ecological patterns or processes, and has worked with the Theoretical Population Dynamics Group at the University of Amsterdam and with the Fisheries Center at the University of British Columbia. He spent 15 years with Alberta Fish and Wildlife studying environmental flows, and now works with Alberta's chief scientists to support scientific excellence in government. Andrew is an adjunct professor at the University of Calgary in the Department of Biological Sciences. And with that, I'll let him take over.
So to keep the tradition going, I am also not a salmon biologist. And my presentation today is not a prescription or a lesson for the Trinity River. I guess like Kurt, I want to share some of my learnings over the last 30, 35 years working on aquatic ecosystems. And I'd like to look at this by contrasting experience and knowledge. My son is a carpenter, and we were driving through the city of Calgary a couple months ago, and he pointed out this building to me. He said, "Hey, Dad, what do you think about this building?" And I said, "Oh, this is a great example of deconstructionist architecture where the asymmetry that causes conflict with your brain and just draws the viewer in towards the building." My son kind of laughed and he said, "Yeah, during my first year apprenticeship training, our instructor took us outside, pointed at this building and said, 'This is why you follow a building plan.'" So apparently my knowledge of architectural techniques was not consistent with my son's experience from his instructor on building, and presumably the knowledge of the construction crew that built this building wasn't equal to the knowledge of the architect that put together the building plans. So knowledge is not always equal to experience. And my talk is not on building architecture. I want to now turn to native trout recovery in Alberta, which I've been involved with over those 30, 35 years of my career. And in the mid-90s, like many jurisdictions in Western North America, there was a concerted effort towards restoring bull trout populations in a number of areas. And so a similar thing happened in the province of Alberta. 95, they introduced a large campaign, became the provincial fish of Alberta. The regulations went to catch and release throughout the province, and a number of recovery actions went into place. And a few things came out of that effort in the mid-90s. One was our province gained international notoriety for being completely socially unaware when their slogan for this whole program was, back here, no black, it's now the law. Apparently people weren't thinking too clearly when they put that one together. The other thing that came out from that work was some early recovery efforts that we had great success with them. That experience tended to then influence how we looked at recovery programs from that point forward. This wonderful photo here that was taken by Kelly Rowell, a colleague of mine, is from the lower Kananaskis Lake. Bull trout, bull char, mature bull char swim in that lake. Wonderful population. We almost extirpated that population prior to 1992. through angler harvest. There was a minimum size limit on those fish. It was smaller than the size of maturity for the adult population, and we were harvesting well over half of the immature recruits before they had a chance to move into the adult population. In 1992, catch and release regulations were introduced on that lake. So in this figure here, the little triangles at the top, that is the adult population in that lake. It went from under 50 individuals in 1991 when we almost got rid of it, and then increased dramatically over those next 10 years. These squares here are the number of new adult recruits that were entering the population. And it stabilized out at about 400 new adults entering the population in about 95, 96. Because we knew we could estimate what the adult natural mortality rate was, we had this fixed recruitment rate. In the mid-90s, 95, 96, we made a prediction of what the adult population should increase to, really simple mathematics. We predicted about 2,000 adults, which should be where this population stabilizes out. It stabilized out at about 1,650, 1,700 adults. We were pretty darn close in that estimate. And we were feeling pretty good that we knew what recovery meant for native trout populations after this example. Well, as people know, recovery actions fall into this class of problems that we often refer to as wicked problems. Angler harvest isn't the only thing that's affecting bull trout across the range, both within Alberta and outside of our province. They have to compete with non-native fishes. And there's other activities on the landscape. It could be oil and gas. It could be forestry, cattle grazing, a number of different human activities going on that influence. And as well, this is all couched underneath climate change, which affects not only temperature precipitation patterns that influence the stream, but also ecosystem processes like forest fire and fire return in intervals. So there's this whole complex system that's going on, and trying to understand native trout recovery within that complex system becomes much more difficult. We had that early success in Lower Kananaskis Lake. Things all of a sudden became more difficult. And I want to take time, or what I want to do in this talk is to focus on two case studies that I've been involved with. These are from Quirk Creek and Rocky Creek, both in Alberta. And I want to contrast this idea of experience and knowledge. Quirk Creek was driven largely by our experience. It came very shortly after our early success on the Lower Kananaskis, or at least initial recovery on that Lower Kananaskis population. And we developed the recovery actions. It was good thinking, good experience, but we developed them relatively informally. The other case study I want to look at is from Rocky Creek, and that one is where we used people's knowledge, and that could come from experience, but we tried to move that into knowledge, and we recognize that our knowledge is often very uncertain. So that's why I've got in brackets here, or lack thereof. We recognize that in many cases we didn't know what was going on. And we put it into a cumulative effects model. Really, it's a decision support system. It was not a complex model, very semi-quantitative model, but it allowed us to put our thinking, our little bits of knowledge together into some decision making. So let's look at this first case study. This is Quirk Creek. The players here, the important players here, are two native fishes, West Slope cutthroat trout in the upper panel, in the middle bull trout, and then non-native brook trout that are in the system. And comparison of electrofishing estimates of the population, one done in the late 1970s, showed that about 3/4 of the population was made up of the two native species, bull trout and cutthroat trout. About 1/4 of the fish were brook trout. In 1996, similar electrofishing done on the creek showed that now the population was well over 90% comprised of brook trout, and about 8% were the two native species. And the thinking was, pretty straightforward and well-founded. Get rid of that big red bar, and hopefully the two native fishes will increase in numbers if you get rid of the brook trout. And what we wanted to look at that time, and then the hypothesis we had is, can we use anglers to remove the brook trout such that the two native species would recover in the population? So the study design for Cork Creek, and just for people's spatial context, Cork Creek is a fairly small creek. It's about a third order stream. The fish-bearing portion of that creek is about 12 kilometers in length. There's a couple of major tributaries to it, Mac Creek and Howard Creek, so fairly small system. And in working in that system, first thing, and the whole stream was turned to no harvest to the general public. General public could fish it, but they would have to use catch and release regulations. It's a fairly remote stream. You've got to hike into it, so there wasn't a lot of, at least as we thought, not a lot of angling pressure on that system. And then the experiment was, we took anglers that had passed a fish identification exam, so they could identify a brook trout versus a bull trout and a cutthroat trout, so they knew which ones they could harvest. They were allowed to harvest all of the brook trout that they caught above Mac Creek. And Mac Creek split the fish-bearing part of the creek in about half. So the upper part of the creek was our treatment, where we had anglers out there removing brook trout. The lower part of the creek was the control, where there was no harvest of brook trout by anglers in that lower part. That went on for a couple of years, and two things happened. The first thing is the fishing got really bad in the upper part of the creek. Anglers are encouraging them to go out there and fish for brook trout. And it just sucked for brook trout fishing after a couple of years. So they were like, I don't really want to go out anymore fish because it's not that much fun. And the other thing is we didn't see the recovery in the two native fish species that we were expecting. So we're like, well, I guess what we'll do is we'll open up the bottom part of the creek to fishing. That way there was now fish that the anglers could catch. They were happy again, so these volunteer anglers were out harvesting brook trout again. That was good. So the program continued on for a few more years. And then again, when we're looking at the data, we hadn't seen the recovery in the native fishes that we were expecting. So sort of classic human thinking, if something isn't working, that's because you're not trying hard enough or not hammering it hard enough. So we just kept beating on this thing harder. And now we added electrofishing removals into this program as well. So between 2004 and 2008, we started removing brook trout by electrofishing in both the upper and the lower parts of the creek at different locations. After a few more years, still hadn't seen the cutthroat trout recovery that we were expecting. And it was getting hard to get people to go up into the upper part. That required more effort to get them up there. Fishing wasn't as good up there for brook trout. So in 2010, the harvest of brook trout in the upper part of the creek stopped, but anglers could still harvest brook trout in the lower part. And then in 2015, now we're well over 15 years, 17, 18 years into this program. People were tired. There was a new area biologist in that area. Managing this program was becoming more difficult because you have to issue these special licenses to these volunteer anglers. Still hadn't been the recovery in the native fish population that we were expecting. And in 2015, he just stopped that program. So there was no longer any harvest of brook trout throughout the whole creek. So if you're looking at this slide and going, I don't see a study design in here. Like, this just looks like you guys were doing stuff willy-nilly. You're not alone. What was consistent through that time, and fortunately continued even after 2015, is that there was annual population estimates, electrofishing done on the creek in at least a couple of sites, in many years, quite a number of sites. So we have good population data sampling was done in 78, 87, and then from 1995 onwards, there was these annual estimates from the creek that we could look at the data. It occurred almost every year. There was years when fire risk prevented crews from going in, and then there was another year where there just wasn't enough money to get a crew to go out and do the work. But almost sampling every year. And when we look at the data, and that's in this graph here, this is adult or mature cutthroat trout in the stream. It's the y-axis is the catch rate, so catch of these mature fish per 300 meters of stream. That's the standard sampling site. Through time, it's very variable. This data, not too unexpected for fish populations. If you look at this data, 20 for the Upper Creek, 1980, 1998, the 2010 was when fish were being removed. So in this region here, and then for below the creek, brook trout were being removed from 2000 to 2015 in this region. You don't see a whole lot when you just look at the data this way. And this dashed line in this figure was a decided upon recovery target that the province had set to say, yeah, we think our population of cutthroat trout has moved from a very high risk situation out of that situation. So that dashed line was a recovery target that was being looked at. A really good thing happened in 2020, is we had a postdoc start to work on this data again. And Nilosa Natabi looked at it, and just like myself and probably yourself, she said, there is no study design here. But what Nilo was able to do was kind of look through that and say, okay, well, what can I shoehorn together? What can I get from this data? And what Nilo did is she said, well, let's just break this data into different periods. We've got some early data that was before 1995 when there was just a sampling in 78 and 87. And then in 1995, this is when we had those annual population estimates going on. So there's an early period, that's before the annual estimates. 1995, she called the pre-suppression period. So this was before anglers were out there removing fish as part of the program. So 1995 to when the start of the angler harvest started, she called the pre-suppression period. Suppression period was when anglers were harvesting the fish and the electrofishing removals took place. And then there was this post-suppression period afterwards. And Nilo just said, well, let's just see if there's a pattern going on between these different periods. And we put it into a classical mixed effects type model where you've got a hierarchical structure or multi-level structure to the model. We're interested in this period effect, but of course we're going to have random effects for sites, for years, and for the different reaches. And to look at effect sizes, Nilo said, well, let's just see how things changed relative to the pre-suppression period. Relative to the pre-suppression period, did a given fish species increase or decrease during that suppression period? And it was a brilliant way to put a lack of a design together into some kind of format that we could actually now start looking at the data and looking at it, understanding the variability in a more sensible way. So this is now just data. So this is for mature brook trout in the creek. The different colors on these points just represent the different periods of when anglers were not removing fish, so the pre-suppression, post-suppression periods. And what we can see in this data now is that and we put it into a Bayesian framework, so these probabilities are actual posterior probabilities, so we can kind of talk in actual chance of these things happen. There was really good support that mature brook trout decreased during the suppression period. 95% support that we decreased the mature brook trout through both angling and electrofishing removal. The effect size was about just over a 50% decline in brook trout. We got rid of, or we were able to decrease that brook trout population by just over 50%. And what was also, actually was very interesting is that if you looked at the post-suppression period, so this is when anglers stopped going out to the creek, we kept doing the electrofishing estimates. that it looked like that reduction in the population maintained, so that with the decrease was sustained in brook trout through that post-suppression period. This is the same data that I presented earlier on the mature cutthroat trout. Now it's just recolored for those different suppression periods. And this, for over 27 years, hadn't been pulled out of the data until Nalot put it into the structure and looked at it. That there was really strong support that the mature cutthroat trout population increased. The increase was about threefold. And there's really high uncertainty in that estimate. You can get it from the Bayesian estimates. It might have been only an 8% increase in the adult population. It could have been up to an order of magnitude increase in the adult population. But there's strong support that we actually did have an effect on the mature cutthroat trout population, and that was lost for many years. There's weak support that increase in the mature cutthroat population was sustained once the removals stopped. It went down to 87% probability that the decrease was sustained. You can flip that around and say that's about a 1 in 8 chance that there was no sustained increase in the population. I can do a little bit of a post-mortem on this analysis from it over those years. The first thing is the absence of a spatial control meant that we couldn't disentangle other spurious effects causing the changes we see. In particular, if you remember, the creek was closed to general harvest by the public in 1998. So the increase we saw in cutthroat trout might not have been caused by the brook trout. It might have been caused by the change in angling regulations. That's problematic for putting out an exact cause to it, but I don't see it as being a real fundamental flaw or a real problem. When we're trying to recover populations, sometimes if it recovers and we're not entirely sure what the cause is, maybe we can put together some logic to get some reasonable culprits. Then that's good. We've gone in the right direction. I think the things from this Quirk Creek study in my postmortem that were really problematic is that the fact that we had a lack of a study design meant that the data was not critically looked at for over 27 years. There were reports produced over those 27 periods that just summarized the electrofishing catch data up to that point. It was always comparing it to this perceived recovery target, which was a nice recovery target, but again, that was driven by past experience, largely past experience that we'd seen on that lower Kananaskis population. It wasn't until Nalot put this into a framework where she could look at it more rigorously that we started to learn new things about that data, and it's pretty obvious, I think, why that's problematic. In particular, that's problematic because opportunities for further recovery of this population were essentially missed. If you remember that data, it looked like the brook trout population, its decrease was sustained once the anglers stopped removing fish. It remained low. That might have presented an opportunity for further recovery actions, other work to happen, maybe more electrofishing removals, a number of different activities that could have gone in and potentially augmented that work. So there are opportunities lost from not having looked at this data in the critical way. And the corollary to that is that we started to create mechanisms of why we hadn't thought there was a recovery. And by doing that, we were essentially potentially misinterpreting our data and prematurely assigning causes for why we didn't think a recovery might have happened in that data. And in particular, and I need to take full onus on this, is an early paper of mine that I put out in the early 2000s might have tainted some of the thinking. And in this paper, I said, yes, angling removal of non-native fish could be a useful tool, but you need to be careful because incidental mortality from anglers fishing on the native species, maybe through hooking mortality, misidentification of species, that might be a factor that might cause a lack of recovery in those native populations. When I did this work in 2000, it was a modeling exercise looking at it and saying, yeah, if your hooking or incidental mortality rates on the native fishes are above a certain value, then you could run into problems. We may have prematurely assigned, or we did, I'm going to argue, prematurely assigned that a lack of recovery in the cutthroat trout population that we thought was occurring, even though when Nolo looked at the data, we did see a recovery, was being assigned to, well, this must be caused through incidental mortality, through hooking mortality. So that I see as being really problematic in that study. I now want to turn on to the second case study, Rocky Creek, very similar creek to Quirk Creek. It's a little bit longer in length, third, fourth order stream. It's also a foothill stream. Again, there's a lot of different activities going on in that watershed. There's forestry, lots of recreation. There's oil and gas exploration. There's sport fishing, angling on this creek as well. The fish players in this game, there's some similar ones to Quirk Creek. There's both native bull trout in this system. That one of the non-native fishes in Rocky Creek is brook trout as well. But on the native side, there's no cutthroat trout in the system, but there are native Rocky Mountain whitefish. And on the non-native side, there's also some brown trout that move into this system as well. And what was different in Rocky Creek, and that I really want to highlight, is in that system, when the recovery actions were being looked at, the group that was planning that recovery action went through this decision support process in evaluating what it is they should look at. And Jordan Rosenfeld, a colleague of mine, he's adjunct at UBC, but works for the BC government. He published a paper on this cumulative effects model in Trends in Ecology and Evolution just a couple of years ago, where he describes it. But it's a very simple model, and it takes pieces of knowledge that people can share either through experience or from theory or from reading the literature. It puts those pieces of knowledge together into this cumulative effects, into a cumulative effects framework. And for the Rocky Creek example, there was just over 15 different stressors that were thought to be impacting native bull trout in that system, or reducing the native bull trout population. And really what this cumulative effects model does is it quantifies how much of the stressor we think there is. Given the level of that stressor, do we think it's has a minor effect on the population, a larger or a very large effect, turns it into a semi-quantitative kind of thing, puts all of those stressors together, kind of answers the question, do you think one or two things are affecting the population, or do you think maybe all 15, or there's a large number of things affecting the system? It doesn't give you predictions as to what you think is going on. It gives you hypotheses, and you can incorporate uncertainty into this framework as well, but it just generates hypotheses. And if you've got a system where there's maybe 10 or 12 different stressors that you are thinking are impacting that native population, it's going to be clear that that's going to be a hard system to work on and to try and recover the population. This is an example where there's many different watersheds the recovery groups are looking at. Which one of these watersheds should I work on? And they're going to look at ones where they're most likely to have an influence. So if there's one or two things that they have control over or can try and fix, then that represents a place that you can go out and do this kind of experiment. So that's what was done for Rocky Creek. They ran this cumulative effects decision support system for Rocky Creek, and two things came out as the main stressors in the system. There's, given both forestry and oil and gas in this area, there's a lot of access roads going through the area because of recreation. These access roads remain being used even after they try to decommission them. Folks are pretty ingenious at going on these roads even after certain kinds of deactivation. So there's a lot of recreational activity. Sediment input to the stream was hypothesized to be one of the big drivers. This photo on your left is in the upper part of the creek, and the whole creek is actually flowing down a tire channel here on the left. And there was numerous crossings, all of them pumping sediment into the system. So sedimentation came out as one of the hypothesized strong drivers of the system. The other one was because of all of the access, angling access, or angling, so there's no harvest on the native fishes here, or native bull trout, but either through hooking mortality or illegal harvest, angling came out as a secondary or second potential important stressor on. So those are the two hypotheses on the system. And the crew said, or the folks working on this said, yep, those are two things we think we can work on to recover. Let's see if we, again, these are hypotheses, if we go out and we try to remedy those two things, can we see recovery? The study design for Rocky Creek followed the classical before-after control impact design. So we actually had 3 controls in this system, Elk, Cutoff, and Limestone Creek watersheds. They were all very similar sizes to Rocky Creek, kind of an ideal situation. They had the same fish assemblages in them, so very ideal controls. One treatment system, this was Rocky Creek. The before period was before 2017. That shouldn't say equal 2017. That should be before 2017. The after period was 2018 and onward. And in the spring, summer, and fall of 2017, the folks work in that area essentially opened a can of whoop-ass rehabilitation, where they went all out. They recovered, I can't remember how many kilometers of trails that cross the creek. Classic sediment control, willow staking, trail decommissioning, as well as a public campaign to make sure folks recognize what was going on. So they were able to reduce sediment, also reduce access by anglers to the system, which inherently would made angling reduce the angling pressure on the system, or the angling on the system. Again, we can just look at the raw results, and this, although it spans not actually similar period for Quirk Creek. Again, it's different sites sampled in each of the watersheds or each of the points. Rocky Creek are the little plus signs in here. When you look at all of your sites and all of your data, there's always lots of variability in fish data spatially. I shouldn't say always, often there is a lot of variability in fish data spatially. The nice thing about Rocky Creek is we had a study design that was decided upon ahead of time. And in fact, we commissioned a statistician, Dr. Carl Schwartz, who I believe has done work for the Trinity as well in the past. He put together our BACI design before the experiment had even finished. He had all the code ready for this to go. Just probably a refresher for most folks on these BACI designs. You're not looking for a before-after effect. So you're not looking for a significant before-after effect. You're not looking for a significant control impact effect. Your treatment effect is looking at, is the change before-after different between the control and the impact sites? So the treatment effect you're looking for in these models is this interaction term, the before-after control impacted interaction term. Is that your significant effect in these models? And then, of course, you have a number of random effects for years and sites and watersheds, and we allowed the year effect to differ among watersheds as well. And, very simply, if you just look at this plot here, the fuchsia line, I think, or purple line, and that is a treatment effect. You can see the slope of that line is different than the 3 controls. That's that significant interaction term that you're looking for. Again, this was put into a Bayesian framework so that there was strong support that this before-after interaction is different from 0. There was a treatment effect. And, you can put, this is the paper that came in Laura's paper that was published just came out last year. Rocky Creek, or the treatment system, is the one on the far right, where you can see this treatment effect. The projected, or the estimated effect size for Rocky Creek was that the bull trout population, the number of adult bull trout, increased by about threefold, which is interesting, and this is just coincidental, was similar to what we thought we'd seen in Quirk Creek once Nalo had analyzed that data as well. So very quickly, a little post-mortem on the Rocky Creek example. First off, the decision support system allowed us to define the hypotheses before the recovery actions started, and it gave a clear understanding among all the different players. And there were a number of stakeholders that were involved in this. Everyone had an understanding of what the hypotheses were that were going to be tested. And if different stakeholders had concerns that there were other stressors, other things going on, they could be included within that cumulative effects model at the start, so that there was agreed upon design of that study moving forward at the start. The BACI design is a way that you can control for spurious temporal spatial effects, so that allowed us to make much stronger conclusions from that experiment than we could in Quirk Creek. And by having an agreed upon study design and then having Dr. Schwartz's work on the statistical models occur beforehand, allowed us to look at that data immediately after the experiment had finished, which is really important both for getting back to stakeholders, but getting back to people's managers and communicating. That was really important in this study. Not everything in Rocky Creek was, rainbows and lollipops. The study design couldn't disentangle the separate effects between sedimentation or angling. Both of those things were remediated together. It wasn't a factorial experiment where you could separate those things out. So it could have been caused by, it could have been a recovery through improved sediment, could have been angling, a reduction in angling, can't disentangle those effects. The other thing that I want to point out is preventing the controls from getting dropped from that study was an ongoing battle. Like, I'm going to assume most of us in this room are scientists. We understand the importance of controls in true experimental or in experimental designs. I think when you go to management school, you get taught the controls are like the devil's spawn or something, and it's wasted effort. Because there was an ongoing battle with managers to do the assessments in a year in each one of those watersheds. Took a crew of about 4 to 6 people and about 5 days to do. So that's not an insignificant amount of time to do it. And the view on those controls is that why are we putting that effort into systems we hadn't worked on? So it was a constant battle with managers to convince them of the importance of doing that work. The other difficulty in keeping those controls going came from a really different point, and that was visually. So after Rocky Creek was rehabilitated in 2017 with the willow staking and the reduction in sediment, a lot of different stakeholders said, hey, this looks really good. Like, just visually, we like what we've done to the creek. Let's go do this to Elk Creek. And now, as scientists, we were saying, no, don't. You're going to ruin our experiment if you go and do these good things to another creek right now. So it's kind of like in a medical example where you're doing a study, you might see some effects of a drug treatment, and now you're saying, no, don't let the folks on the placebo know because we want to get really good results from this. So we all of a sudden kind of felt bad about this, but we were having to say, no, let's keep those controls so that we can understand if this has worked or not. So keeping those controls was a real difficulty. And with that, I'm just going to wrap up my talk and kind of share with you what I think I've learned, both from those 2 experiments, but also over a few decades of doing this work. Early in my career, I had the great pleasure of doing a graduate degree with the late David Schindler, limnologist, one of the forefathers or godfathers of whole ecosystem level experiments. This is his classic experiment in the experimental lakes area in northwestern Ontario, Lake 226, where he wanted to the debate at the time was, is nitrogen or phosphorus causing eutrophication in freshwater lakes? Dave took Lake 226, put a impermeable curtain across the middle of the narrowing in the lake. In the upper basin that you can see here, he added phosphorus to the system, and in the bottom basin, he added only nitrogen. The upper lake turned soupy green. They took this photo, and the story was told. Unreplicated experiment, but very decisive, conclusive results from that study that led to changes in nitrogen, especially phosphorus regulation throughout the world. If anyone knew Dave, they would know that he was a sledgehammer. And one way you get through wicked problems, complex ecosystem interactions, is by doing sledgehammer experiments so that you can get at root problems. Dave is the kind of person that could do those sorts of experiments, and the experimental lakes area was a place that you could do large-scale experiments like that. Similar stuff was done for acidification of lakes, where they were able to get through ecosystem complexity by doing these large-scale experiments. Most of us don't have the opportunity to do those kinds of sledgehammer experiments. So the first one is, my learnings are, don't always expect a smoking gun in recovery actions. Early on, our experience on that lower Kananaskis example, we saw a rapid and strong recovery in that bull trout population. It gave us an image in our mind and our experience that this is what recovery is going to look like. When we go out and worked on Quirk Creek, we're expecting to see the same thing each time. Don't expect that. If it happens, great, good for you. That's wonderful, but don't always expect that. When we don't have a smoking gun sitting out there that just require a photo, published in, I think it was published in Science, but it just showed up in the media that told the experiment. When you're not able to do that, all of a sudden your controls become very important to understanding what's going on in the system. And I need to choose my words carefully here. I don't want folks to come away from this talk saying Andy Paul said controls are not critical. What I want to say is controls are not always possible. And if you can't have a control in your system, then you need to factor that into your study design and how you're going to interpret results and how you're going to interpret both what you think is a positive effect or no effect. So you need to be clear and understand what's going on. But controls are important. Know your study design before starting. Collectively use everyone's experience in whatever tool you can through some level of decision support system. We use that cumulative effects model that was able to take in people's experience, bits of knowledge, and develop some hypotheses that everyone could agree upon. So know your study design before you start. This one came from, by having Dr. Schwartz had the statistical analysis done ahead of time. Know your statistical model before starting as well. Know how you're going to analyze the data. Don't do what we did in Quirk Creek, where we waited 27 years before getting a postdoc to look at it and then go, oh, wow, we missed something over those years. Know how you're going to look at that data in your model. Experience is a good thing. It can inform the studies, and it should inform studies. Incorporate that experience in a transparent way that allows everyone's experience to be counted for. We did that on Rocky Creek using this decision support system that allowed everyone's concerns to come forward. This is not for the Rocky Creek example, but we've used a similar framework to look at management of some of our recreational fisheries, in particular a recreational fishery on rainbow trout below the city of Calgary, concerns over declines in that rainbow trout population, a number of different, the fishery sits below a city of 1.5 million people, a number of different stressors on that system. We want to account for all of the concerns that folks have, their experience, their knowledge going in there. So we've got things in the model, including 6-ppd quinone, which is looked at for, say, coho salmon in the Seattle area, where I think coho salmon are the most sensitive species to 6-ppd quinone, which is a compound that comes out of degrading tires, or tire compound. Incorporate experience, do it in a transparent method. And then lastly, changes can happen in your experimental design through time, but make sure those changes are informed, and they're informed through that decision support system, that they're clear as to why those changes are happening. In the Cork Creek example, our change there was, we're not seeing what we want, so just keep doing it harder. That's not a great line of thinking. Evaluate the data, use tools to help inform that going forward. So with that, that is my talk. There's several references that I had throughout there. They are in the talk, and I'm not sure if these presentations are available to everyone afterwards, but there's a list of the references that I cite through there. So I encourage you to look at these ones if you have any questions, either on the decision support system, either the 2 case studies I talked about, or Lower Kananaskis Lake. So thank you very much. And I believe I have time for questions. No grace period like Kurt got on those questions.
I was curious about the decision to have 3 controls and 1 treatment. Why not just 1 control, 1 treatment, or 2 treatments, 2 controls? Can you say anything about that? Seems like a lot of work to do 3 treatments.
Yeah, no, great. Actually, that's a very good question. Be wonderful to have had two treatments, but we were only going to get the can of whoop-ass rehabilitation done on 1 treatment system, so that we were limited to 1 treatment system. In these hierarchical models, you borrow information from where you lack information in one area, you borrow that information from other areas. So understanding variance across those different components. By having 3 controls, you have a better understanding of year effects, watershed effects, site effects. So extra controls allowed us a better grasp of those random effects in the system.
And so the sounds like the treatments took a lot more effort than the monitoring. Then is that right? So it's a lot easier to do 2 extra controls than it was to do another treatment. Is that right?
Yeah, that is fair. Other than the treatment took 1 summer, or it was a spring, summer, and fall period. So it was a intense amount of effort for that summer, and it was a lot of effort to get that treatment done. So that is a fair statement, but it was done in 1 year. Managers, I don't want to diss managers here. There's a reality they have to work with. It's much easier for managers to allocate, I'm going to allocate this effort in a single year, and I know I don't have to allocate it any more years. So actually getting the approval to do that work in the 1 summer, and there was lots of volunteers that were signing up for it, that wasn't as difficult. It was the field crews going out, so that, what did I say, 4 to 6 people for 5 days to do the population assessments in each of those years. Doing that through time, even though overall that would have been, less effort than the rehabilitation thing, because that had to occur for 5 years afterwards. That was difficult.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Yeah. Just folks don't see, but I think we've got a question coming. That's why I'm waiting here.
Thanks for the talk, and gave us a lot to think about, I think. I wanted to ask, sometimes we find ourselves limited to baseline data, and how when we're designing an experimental design, you sometimes need to limit it to that. Or we find ourselves in a situation where we change our methods to where they're no longer comparable to past data collection. And how do you grapple with the decision between doing maybe the best available versus being able to tie it to something that you will have from the past or baseline data?
Yeah, another great question. So I'll tackle it as two: baseline data and changing study design, or changing methods going forward. So first, with baseline data, do not underestimate your baseline data. And your baseline data could be incredibly valuable for providing the control information. If it's a before-after experiment, I mean, obviously that baseline data will be the before period. That Rocky Creek example, if you looked at the timeline, we used, I think, up to 10 years of past data that had been collected for completely other purposes. It was just watershed monitoring. Fortunately, it was done in the same sampling design that we could use it, but that was, I will call it baseline data that was just available. That was part of the decision process of using that Rocky Creek example, because we had all of a sudden this baseline data for the Elk Creek, the other watersheds, like everything just aligned up for those basins. I should say perfectly, but aligned up well. And part of that was being able to use that baseline data. So that baseline data is incredibly valuable. Changing methods through time. Things do need to change. I think the term is plan continuation bias. I think that's a term where you set a plan and it's like, we cannot deviate from this plan because it's set. And it's often looked at, especially in the airline industry. It's probably a bad example given many of us are going to be flying in a few days, but it's often used in the airline industry after crashes, where you stick to a plan because it's set and it leads to catastrophic consequences. You don't want to be caught in a plan continuation bias, but you need to carefully evaluate. Fisheries recovery is not happening at the same time scale as flying an airplane. We have much more time to figure out if we need to deviate from that plan and put in the effort. So changing methods need to be looked at really carefully as to, yes, it needs to be done. If it does, then you need to be able to calibrate those old methods to link in past data as best you can through it. And we're facing that now, where we're looking at using, for our walleye fisheries, we use a fall index netting program. It doesn't follow the North American standard index netting, the Nason design that is used throughout much of North America now. So it makes some of our data incomparable on a larger North American perspective. So we were looking at moving from these fall netting methods to the Nason method. That's a complete change in methodology. And it's likely we're going to go that route, but before we go that route, we're doing a lot of effort to calibrate those two methods, to take our baseline data, so our past data using the fall netting method, and make it comparable to the Nason netting going forward. So that's intensive marker capture experiments between those two methodologies to calibrate their catch efficiencies between the two, and figure out how they go together. So it can involve changing methodologies can likely involve a lot of work to understand how to link that past data to make it useful going forward. But that's important to keep that data together. Useful.
Thanks. Yeah, I think sometimes it can be difficult to understand how to build that bridge, but maybe once you're able to, then you can make the change and still have that added value.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because building that bridge between our fall netting and our nascent netting, there's a lot of work going into that. And again, that's like, oh my goodness, do we really need to go out and mark several thousand walleye to figure out what the catch efficiency is of these two methodologies? It's an awful amount of work in the years that it happens. And I guess I can speak to you in 5 or 10 years to say if it pays off. But we think that, yes, that work is necessary now so that in the future we're able to pull all of this information together and make it useful.
Thanks. If I can, I'd ask one more question. If anyone has a question, I'd let them. But I'll ask it at the panel discussion.
You bet. Yeah.
Go. Great presentation. Thank you. So, first example, successful removal of a non-native fish. You see a population level of response. So what? Where did that go from there? You demonstrate it, bringing in a postdoc, awesome, reanalyzing the data, demonstrating a population level response. What happened with it?
So you're going to have to get me back in 5 years to let you know where it goes.
Maybe to simplify then, did managers decide then to do something with that? Where is it going from those data?
What I've shown you today, I need to go back and share with our managers, and they need to figure out where they're going to go forward. So I can't answer your question because I don't know where it's going forward. But the reason that is because right now a lot of people still think that Quirk Creek was unsuccessful. We shouldn't have done that work because we may have had a detrimental effect on the native fishes from those anglers being out there through hooking mortality. That is still largely the message is understood. And I don't want to diminish that could be a factor. But when you look at the data, we're seeing a recovery. If that was a factor, you'd expect that this is getting into details here, but it's a great question. The post-suppression period, we would have expected the native fish, if it was hooking mortality, during the post-suppression period, the native fishes would have increased again if it was a hooking mortality, because then they would have been relieved from the hooking mortality. You don't see that strong effect happening, so the data is not supporting that that's a strong effect. The thinking hasn't changed in the decision-making level that Quirk Creek was a successful example. So I don't know where it's going to lead, but if you ask me the question, where do you think it could lead to, or what do you think could happen next?
Let's just pretend I asked you that question.
I would like to see it as, okay, what next can be done to Quirk Creek? Maybe it's more electrofishing removals of those of brook trout in that system to see if we can recover or keep that recovery of the native cutthroat trout going in and persist in the future. Let's put it into a study design where we're looking at it critically, statistically in 5 years or 4 years, whatever we decide on that period, and make decisions, informed decisions going forward from it. And there's a lot of tools that are coming out now in the native trout recovery, including use of pesticides, other things. I'm not sure if that is the tool, but I think it's good for recovery folks making those, to look at all the tools. What else could you do with the system? Because it looks like, if anything, we might have kickstarted that recovery. Let's try and keep that going forward.
Thank you.
And I will say, to also change the message that, and this is my viewpoint, this will be controversial when I start talking about it going back, but to change the message that we can't use anglers to harvest the non-native fishes because of that impact on the native fishes. Sure, you could, let's be concerned on it, but our Quirk Creek data isn't supporting that standpoint. Yeah.
I got several questions, but I'll just flag one for a future one. The smoking gun one is one maybe on the panel discussion one, and how you handle that. But the other would be,
I'll get ready for it tonight.
Okay. The other two ones would be, how much does did the government, I'm sure the land ownership and all that was parts of what you were having to work with. How much was that of an influence? And then the bigger one for me is, was indigenous knowledge or any of that at all used for like identifying what you guys were after in your objectives? And that's one way to.
Yeah, great questions. So again, I'll take them as two parts. How is indigenous knowledge used in the decision support system? And then the second one was what was the influence of many different stakeholders, levels of government in putting those actions forward. So with respect to the indigenous knowledge one, it was not used in the Rocky Creek example, which is unfortunate. It should have been used. That framework, that decision support system framework, that model of Jordan Rosenfeld's that I showed in the one figure there in one of the references, it can be used to incorporate indigenous knowledge into the decision making. It wasn't done in Rocky Creek, but I have colleagues that have used it for on the Adams River in British Columbia. So this is a big sockeye salmon run in the interior of BC, and in that system they have incorporated indigenous knowledge into that framework system. So it's set up in a way, as I talked about, where you can take experience, you can use either publications, theory, experience to populate those stressor response curves. And in that example, my colleague was able to work with indigenous groups to incorporate their knowledge into that support system. So it can be done. It wasn't done in Quirk Creek. So the second question on different levels of government in getting the program going forward, as well as other stakeholders. Simple answer is yes, that was difficult, and there was many different levels of government that everyone had to be on board on it. So Carl Walters put out a paper, I think it was 97, looking at why adaptive management experiments fail. And he boiled it down to three different things. But one of the things that he identified is that successful adaptive management projects have worked when there is a dedicated person that is able to not get dissuaded, not feel defeated, and keeps carrying the project forward. So in that Rocky Creek example, there was a person that was leading it that was able to keep that project going forward, even after getting knocked down several times. She did an amazing job. She had to deal with things that just weren't socially appropriate for anyone to deal with, and she was able to get through those things, keep things going, and keep that project alive. So it really comes down to her work that kept it going forward. I will add to that answer, though, that originally that Rocky Creek example that I talked about was going to be a much larger habitat effects from angling effects. So we had it in a factorial design where we would rehabilitate habitat, but still allow angling in the system, remove angling, but not do habitat, and then do the combined treatment. So in a full factorial design. So that was, closing systems to angling harvest as one of the treatment designs. That one died in 2015, and it died in a rather amazing ball of flames. The project, it was occurring in, I think, 10 different watersheds across the whole eastern slopes of Alberta. It was quite a big design at a province-wide public forum. The minister announced that we're not going ahead with these angling closures, and the biologists in the room, that's the first they heard it. So it was a ministerial level decision where they just said, nope, we're not doing this. They were getting too much flack, too much push on it, and the minister, I mean, that's why they're in those positions. They made the decision at that ministerial level, and the experiment died in an instant at a public meeting. Again, and Jessica Riley is the person I'm speaking to that organized it. She was able to, okay, let's pick up the pieces and let's go forward and do the experiment we can do, given it couldn't happen there. So yes, there are many levels of government and stakeholders. It was not an easy process to get that project ahead. And an earlier example died, as I discussed, because it wasn't in the public interest of elected officials at that time. I think that's the right way to answer it. Yeah.